I'm sure there are a lot of questions to the people who have spoken, or maybe you've got comments or observations or thoughts about what do we do next? Where do we go from here? So I think maybe the way we'll do this is to give as many people as possible a chance to speak. I might take 4 or 5 comments or questions first, and then see if anybody on the panel wants to respond, and then if we still have time, we'll take another round of questions after that. Now, there are 2 roving microphones, so and perhaps when you get a microphone, if you just say your name and if you're from an organisation, what that organisation is. So, does anybody want to kick off with a comment or a question? Down here.
Hello, I'm Tina Gregory, and I work for Clanmore Sure Start. And just a couple of observations. Just like to thank the speakers. It was really, I'm delighted I made the journey from Belfast because it was absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much. I have concerns about some of the evidence base that we talk about in terms of random control trials. And I have a fear that sometimes we do import programs that are not effective from other countries and buy them in just because they have an evidence base. I think we have a very big evidence base, although it's not around an RTC. We have a very big evidence base of some of the programs that do work. I have a concern that we need to have individualised programs for parents and for children, as opposed to just the bought-in models. And the other thing I would just like to say is that there's also community organisations in the north, rather than just the statutory and voluntaries, which were mentioned earlier.
Okay. Any other? Yeah, Roddy.
My name is Roddy Quinn. I'm a GP from Sligo, and I'm here representing the Irish College of General Practitioners. And this has been a fantastic morning, I must say. GPs, as most of you will know, witness on a daily basis the results of poorly supported parenting. And I was just very interested in something that Marion was saying there about breaking the transmission of ineffective parenting. I mean, we would, and something that maybe along those lines that wasn't mentioned so much this morning was the role of grandparents. And we in general practice, as I'm sure a lot of other people in the room, we see the role of grandparents in prolonging the transmission of ineffective parenting in a lot of cases. And I'm just wondering, do some of the programs take into account the incredible role that grandparents play in parenting?
Okay. Yeah, Karen in the middle. Okay. Just 1 minute. We'll take you next. Karen, do you want to go next?
Thanks. I'm Karen Kiernan from One Family, and I've been delighted to be involved with the Special Interest Group for the last couple of years. And we thought it was very important because there was never really anywhere for us to hook our work around parenting into. So I think a lot of us who are service organisations will find it very helpful when we do get a national parenting strategy. And I think one of the other things that the group is trying to do is to look at issues around stigma and how parents access programmes. So One Family has 2 manualised parenting programmes, and I just wanted to mention 3 common challenges, or 3 the biggest challenges we have, and get a view from the panel maybe on these. One is how to position ourselves in terms of evidence in a country where there are a multitude of parenting programmes at different levels, and we think that we have some unique offerings, but it's really quite a bit of work for small organisations to do this. The other then is Ireland doesn't and isn't going to have resources around universal provision of parenting support. So in Sweden, for example, every parent pregnant gets a parenting programme. The stigma around accessing supports formally is very low. So how can we normalise and help people who may benefit from supports and who may actually want it but feel the pressure around stigma to quite a degree? How can we help them? And slightly linked to that are parents who are required on a compulsory basis, either because of care orders or family law courts, to attend parenting. And again, it's a different situation. I just wonder whether the panel would have any comments on it.
Okay, there's one question down.
Hi, Ciara McCarthy. I'm a psychologist working with children with emotional and behavioural difficulties in a primary care setting. And I suppose a huge concern, I suppose I would welcome firstly hugely a parenting framework, because I think a lot of my colleagues as practitioners would have a huge concern that the complexity that's involved in parenting and the responsibilities that go with that, I suppose without stating the obvious, but every parent was once a child themselves, that very often we're seeing children where those hugely complex issues related to parenting, community and society are being overly located in the child. And very often it is the case where the difficulties in parenting are manifesting in children's difficulties, and the children are being held accountable, if that makes sense. So huge difficulties with accessing resources and help for children in the absence of, or I suppose the over-diagnostic framework. So in other words, the only way to get help for children is very often by locating all of those difficulties and yielding a diagnosis. So a very narrow assessment and an even narrower response.
We'll just take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Helen Mortimer from MCI, Mayo Children's Initiative, a project that works with children and young people who experience domestic abuse. And I am just wondering aloud whether when we talk about better outcomes for children, we're always assuming that it's always better for children to have fathers engaged in parenting, and even to refer to Article 9 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It talks about the rights of children to stay in contact with parents in the circumstances of being separated, and our experience is that that is not always the case. And I was glad to hear Marion talk about one size doesn't fit all, because certainly in cases where there's domestic abuse, it certainly doesn't.
Okay, just one last question, then we'll go to the panel. Aisling.
Aisling Gillen, National Office, Child and Family Services within the HSE. Thanks to all our speakers. I must say I really enjoyed it. Very reassuring presentations, I think, today in terms of some of the work that we're involved in relation to the Child and Family Agency. We've developed a national strategy for the new Child and Family Agency, Investing in Parenthood, which is really around what we should be doing, to advise ourselves in relation to what we should be doing around supporting parents in the new Child and Family Agency. And I suppose just what we're trying to do within that is to basically advocate that we move towards more, as Stella said earlier, move towards more evidence-based ways of working, particularly through our commissioning processes, but also, I suppose, close to our hearts with a new agency that's going to have about 4,000 staff, is the practice change in really reorientating ourselves. And I think Marion was very strong in this, that it's not just about new programmatic initiatives, but also that change in practice around what we should be doing in every aspect of our work around supporting parents. We have developed 50 key messages in supporting parents across the life cycle of the child and for parenting in different contexts. And we're hoping to use that to inform the practice of all of our practitioners in the agency in terms of supporting parents in the best way we possibly can do. So I suppose in terms of a national strategy, Toby, I really would be advocating that kind of balance between, yes, we do need, in our commissioning process to be moving towards more evidence-based programs in that practice, but also that in the practice of every individual working with children and families, how do we really begin to develop a whole I suppose, ethos and culture of really supporting parents in every aspect of our practice, and that a national strategy, is that thing that in Scotland, the actual strategy should impact on the actual work with children and families, and just the balance there between both of those aspects.
Okay, we've got a number of different themes coming out there around, evidence was one, and the role of RCTs, and the challenge of evidence for small organisations. There's a theme around stigma, especially in a context where universal provision is a challenge. How do we ensure practice approaches, not just programs, are impacted by a strategy. The role of grandparents and the transmission of parenting, and the role of the community and voluntary sector. So a number of themes there. Anybody from the panel want to kick off some responses? Stella.
Maybe address the... is this working?
Can we have one of the roving mics maybe at the front? If that's right.
The whole issue of evidence-based and evidence-informed, and I know this is a debate that is raging across Europe and globally as well, but particularly in Ireland. And so in the Centre for Effective Services, we've tried to make a distinction between evidence-based and evidence-informed. So we talk about evidence-based, a programme, service or intervention that has been rigorously, independently evaluated using the highest standard of research, and in that context we're talking about RCTs. But in terms of evidence-informed, we talk about programmes, practice or services that are based on practice, knowledge and wisdom, which draws on the capacity of practitioners and researchers, but also uses the best research evidence, kind of from systemic research. And I suppose that allows us to draw on all of the practice, knowledge and wisdom that is out there, and Tina made reference to it as well, and also Karen, in terms of the difficulty of trying to get support for your programmes. I think the important thing is that, yes, there's been an influx of imported programmes, not just in relation to parenting, that have been independently evaluated and have been shown to be effective across the board, and that they can be easily adapted to the cultural context in which they're delivered. But I think the important thing in terms of us getting into a new era about service commissioning is about you must continually evaluate what you're doing. So you must evaluate, and not always using the most expensive types of evaluation techniques. There are other cheaper ways to do it out there, but that you're proving that your particular programme or service is effective, and that's going to be the basis on which services are commissioned into the future.
Mary.
I just wanted to continue on that and say I think what we haven't got, while we have got a range of programmes that have been evaluated, I think what we need is the coordination and information from those evaluations being available, so that there's joined up thinking about what the commissioners expect and what shows to produce the best outcomes for parents. Having gone through an RCT, which was extremely expensive, and as people know me, I have the scars to show for it, I would not be seeing that as being something that can be used for everyday work. However, there are very good, effective principles that we can use in approaches that can be applied in approaches and in programmes. And I think the shared experiences and understanding of what those are, for example, like how we engage with the range of client groups, can be extremely valuable for how we take forward any parenting work. Just like to pick up on the issue of the fathers, and from the lady who mentioned from the domestic violence point of view. I would certainly be of the view that fathers ought to be involved, but there are obviously situations where that is not desirable, in the same way as it's not desirable that all mothers should be involved, unfortunately, with their children. However, I think what we have at the moment is that fathers have been for many, many years left out and not been viewed as being equally valuable in the parents' upbringing. And there's very good research that shows that fathers' influence does make a difference to how children behave. For example, I understand that it delays early sexual activity for teenagers. So I think I would like to see much more engagement with fathers and a much fairer and more equal attitude to fathers and mothers being involved in the parenting.
Thanks. There's been a number of very important issues there, and I'd like to touch on some of them. Firstly, I think the mention of grandparents, I think that's critically important. I mean, I was talking about, viewing families as a whole system. That's not just, the mum and dad and the Waynes that are in the house. That's, the kind of, the systems with which these families interact within their extended family and community. And again, you know, I know you've got a longitudinal study in Ireland, and I think it's worth looking at some of those findings as well. But the one we're doing in Scotland looked particularly, what they usually do is, you know, follow the progress and well-being of each child, you know, every year, but then look at probably 4 or 5 topics in depth every year as well. And a couple of years ago, they looked at the role of grandparents. What's quite clear is that grandparents can mitigate some of the adverse impact of, you know, less effective parenting if they're around and involved, but not in every case. You know, I was talking to somebody who sits in the children's panel, which is our kind of children's welfare and justice system in Scotland and Glasgow, who said that the average age, because there was a lot of children in kinship care because the parents have got substance misuse issues or whatever, and the average age of the grandparents, the grandmothers that were coming in front of the panel, was 34. So you know, these are people who have been lone parents, young parents themselves, who are not necessarily always bringing the best parenting experience to that. So I think, again, it's back to personalisation, assessment of individual circumstances. Evidence, yeah. Randomised control trials, I think we've got to be clear what a randomised control trial is. A randomised control trial is that an intervention was better than doing nothing. Now, I would hope, given the cost of some of these programmes, the very least we could expect is that they're better than doing nothing. But I think, you know, what's important is their impact on children's well-being. And you know, to me, there is no other good way of measuring the impact of programmes. And I have to say that, you know, if you look at some of the imported programmes, I think we've been quite careful. There was one local authority that I was working with that trained everyone to deliver incredible years, which is basically focusing on children of particular age range with clinical range conduct disorders. Now, and they were applying it to, you know, as a universal programme. Now, and then wondering why, you know, they weren't getting great results. You know, you've got to actually think, well, what is this set up to address? And I think what we've got to look at is the principles behind the evidence and look at the common features, and Mary touched on some of this, of the things that seem to work. And I think, you know, one of the things that seems very critical is forming a relationship with somebody that, you know, which, and I was trained as a social worker many years ago, and that seems kind of blindingly obvious to me, but, you know, we seem to be not be able to see that you know, the wood for the trees and some of that. So I think we've got to be clear what we're talking about in terms of evidence. Domestic violence, yeah. Absolutely. Not every father is a positive influence. Fathers can be a very positive influence that are engaged. And, you know, I was talking about early cognitive development. Dads can bring a very important, whether they're living in the household or not, they can bring a very important dimension to that. If a dad's a motor mechanic, he's bringing a different range of vocabulary that helps the a child's, you know, synaptic brain development. And it doesn't matter if he's not talking about Cartesian dualism. You know, if he's talking about a carburetor or something, that's more vocabulary that helps that child's brain develop. So, you know, that's, I think, you know, important to recognise and value what dads can bring to a child's development. But when we look at families where there is violence, I think we've also got to think back, what makes a man a violent dad or a violent partner? And very often that's rooted in the experience they had in their early life and their early experience. So you're not going to break that cycle unless you start addressing that. Sorry, I'm going on, so I'll stop now and hand over to Mary.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the questions. I just maybe come back on 2 or 3. Maybe I'll start with the evidence base, because I think everybody in the audience is faced with this kind of issue. And it seems to me a little bit like what Stella said, that we now live in an evidence-based world, really, and any of us who provide any kind of service, whether it's me in the university or anyone else, has to kind of continuously justify that what we do has impact at some level. So I think one thing maybe might be that you should always really be getting people who work with you to fill out forms or to give, you know, what counts as evidence, I suppose, is to take a broad view of what counts as evidence. And often good evidence can be feedback from the service or on the basis of the service you provide. Also, I was just thinking, you know, being creative about it, because I know services are under pressure on the ground, is maybe the universities could help, or maybe the institutes of technology in the area could help or something, because an awful lot of students have to do projects or even those people in the universities or are also involved in their, assessed by their community engagement. So, that maybe you could use, our services could use that. Or CES, for example, the Centre for Effective Services, produces a lot of information. I think it is an issue, but I also think that if funders want evidence, they have to fund it. And it's not fair on organisations on the ground being funded to run services and then suddenly said, oh, well, where's your evidence? So I think that the state agencies, the national agencies, have to make a commitment to funding evidence if they want it, or otherwise it will be the big organisations, the multinationals, the big service providers who come in and say, oh, here's our evidence. They'll be the ones who are funded. The two very other brief points. I'm glad you raised the point about fathers, and I didn't have time to cover it, but I am a bit worried about what this parenting really means in practice, as I think was clear. And while I completely agree that fathers need, in general, it's a good principle for fathers need to be that fathers need to be involved, I just think we need to think through a little bit more. Are we talking about mothers? Are we talking about fathers? Parenting is not gender neutral. We know that mothers do different things to fathers in families. And we just need to think it through a bit more, I think. And then the third one was about grandparents, which I think is a really important point. And I think, I hope it came clear from my presentation, parenting support has a whole number of tensions involved in it, really. And one tension is about professionalization, that it's seeing something, families as kind of, or family-related events and activities and relationships as a subject of professional intervention. We just need to be careful, because that's moving it away from things like parents being, the source of knowledge, and grandparents and so forth. So there is that tension involved. And I think what we need to be doing is supporting different kinds of activities, really, one of which is ensuring or enabling grandchildren, parents and grandparents to be together as much as possible. Thank you.
Thanks. We've got time for a couple more questions. I know there were some hands up earlier that we didn't get to. Anybody else have a question? Yes, here at the front and then at the back.
Yes, like others, I'd like to congratulate the speakers on an excellent programme. It has been very stimulating. I'd be interested in speakers' views on inclusion and equity in parenting programs, and how we ensure that we mean all children, all parents, and in particular how we look for populations who are at higher risk and genuinely meet their needs and not try and shoehorn people into the one-size-fits-all. I work for MenCap, and obviously my main interests are children with intellectual or developmental disabilities.
Okay, thanks. There was a question towards the back. Yeah.
Pulling together two points that Mary and Marion made around the necessity for a predominant philosophy or a certain political context to really shape and support a good parenting strategy. Just to get people's views on what kind of governmental approaches or underpinning principles need to be there to deliver this kind of strategy. Scotland are in a very good position because you've pulled the children's strategy together. Similarly, down here in Ireland, one of the trends that we're witnessing at the moment, I work for Bernardo's as a children's organisation, is that some of the commissioning for employment services for young people where families are also being engaged in programmes alongside, that there's a very strong counter-philosophy between the two drivers. The employment and training agencies are being commissioned along different incentivising than we would find good for families, and families have broader and different and more complex needs than the commissioning would be aware of from the employment side. So it seems to me if we're going to bring things together across a number of departments and really underpin a good strategy, there would have to be a very sound, coherent, interdepartmental, both philosophy and mindset.
Okay, perhaps one more question. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Kieran McGrath. I work independently. I'm a child welfare consultant. My point really is in relation to mainstreaming, which was mentioned earlier on, because it seems to me this presents a great challenge, and particularly in a climate when there's a lot of restrictions on budgets. In relation to that, though, however, I think we could point out that last year, for example, the HSE spent 24 million in relation to childcare proceedings. That's a huge amount of money in relation to the other end of the spectrum of what we're talking about today, which is about prevention, early intervention, and promotion of parenting. If there is to be mainstreaming, then I think we also have to consider how the professionals providing that are protected. In particular, for example, if you take the Young Ballymun project, which is mainstreamed through, or is provided through the public health nurses and the speech and language therapists, when they're not available, when there's gaps in services, those kind of things have to be protected and have to be included in the provision of our budgets, which ultimately I think is much more productive rather than spending huge amounts of money on the other end of the spectrum. So that's just my point.
Okay. Final question down at the front row. Sorry.
Hi there. Thank you very much. My name is Paula Mackenzie from Parents' Place. I just have, I suppose, more a comment in relation to what you're all discussing today. I suppose the one concern that I would have about introducing any programmes is that we the programmes focus on the children. And in my experience, when I have dealt with parents who come with a problem that they view is with their child, they actually end up talking about what's going on for them. And I feel that in looking at any particular programme, any parenting programme, that we need to do just that. We need to focus on the parent. And if we don't focus primarily on the parent, I think Marion addressed it, and I think you also did as well, is that we actually are losing sight of what's going on, and it's like a deflection if we focus on the child. I think this lady said it as well. We need to have a model in place that's not only behaviouralism. We need to have a model in place that's going to encompass all aspects of the child's well-being and primarily the parent's well-being. Because when we support the parent, ultimately we're supporting the child. And I think we do. I think you mentioned as well. It's paramount that we look at the context of the child's life. And I'm actually involved with an organisation at the moment affiliated with an organisation called IARM, and basically that organisation focuses on just that, the parents. And we work with parents, that supports parents to understand their own behaviours around children. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, we have one more final question, just in the middle here.
First of all, I want to thank the panel for their very inspirational presentations here today, and also reaffirming for me, and I'd say for many other people, that we're doing something right, at least. And just, I suppose, to support Paula there, she's a member of the organisation that I'm a founder member of, which is IARM. And a core of that foundation, of that association, are parent mentors. And the philosophy that we would be advocating moving forward would be parents parenting self first. The programme we use is effective parenting of self and children. And that is the key. You know, the key is in the relationship that the parent has with themselves first and then with their children. And I know there are many, many very good programmes out there. And I think it's about pooling our resources, pooling all our knowledge. There's such a wealth of knowledge and experience in the room here today that moving forward, the framework needs to look, first of all, at the parents, at their challenging issues, and to try and get rid of the blame that's out there, because I think that is what's stopping parents from coming forward for support. That there is no blame. We all do our best. And as Bowlby said, we only need to be good enough parents at any time. Thank you.
Okay, I think there's several more key themes there around inclusion and equity, the philosophy and context for a national parenting strategy, and how that might link to philosophies underpinning the work of other government departments, the challenges of mainstreaming, and the need to focus on parents and parents' well-being and avoid blame. Anybody from the panel want to pick up on any any of those big themes?
Some very big themes there. I don't know if I can pick up on them that well, really, but I was conscious that the stigma question from the last time wasn't asked either, and that, I think, dovetails a bit or links in with the question of inclusion and equity, and also maybe the mainstreaming question. And I think principles are always very important, and I think the principle of universalism really is absolutely vital, and it's not really talked about today at all, and it's not talked about, I think, because we don't have money, but it's also not talked about because there's been an ideological change, really, and that we don't any longer really, not just in Ireland, but generally, we're much more ambivalent about things we took for granted in the past, like the National Health Service or the welfare state in general, or public services and so forth. And there's a continuous stream. If you live in England, it's really interesting. I don't know whether Marion notices this or not. Almost every day there's an article in the paper or the newspaper knocking the health service, the National Health Service, whatever it is. Every day it's a different, or in fact, most days there are 3 or 4 different articles. So we're moved away from the idea of public services being good, I think, or universalism as a principle, which, and I think we should, even in the current times, really, really continue to emphasize, because the only way we can counter stigma and so forth is by the service being available to all on a general basis. Another way that we might is, and I noticed that this was in the Scottish strategy, is having a kind of a discursive, trying to influence public opinion, having campaigns, information and so forth, whereby we try to normalise the idea really that every parent needs help at different stages and every parent needs similar types of help but also variety of help. I think that idea of changing public attitudes would really be important, because I know and you know that parents stop themselves often from seeking help because they feel it's a sign of failure, and of course good parenting is so taken for granted and so much ingrained in us that we feel that we're failing in some fundamental way if we ask for help. So I think attitudinal change is important.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Fortunately, the NHS is a devolved responsibility in Scotland, so what's going on in England doesn't affect us, and there's probably greater public satisfaction with it because there's more of a kind of public service commitment in the current Scottish Government's ideology than there clearly is in the kind of ideology that prevails south of the border. Probably to kind of pick up on all these things, I'll talk about the city of Glasgow, which is the biggest city in Scotland. Probably some of you might even have been there, and maybe quite a few of you may even have relatives there. But Glasgow is, Scotland does not perform well in league tables of health outcomes and health inequalities, and in Scotland, Glasgow is probably worst of all. So there have been a lot of money and a lot of initiatives that have piled into Glasgow over the years, with probably not as much effect as we would like. And in fact, one of my friends was going in a taxi up one of the kind of main roads in Glasgow, and it's clearly become a kind of talking point for tourists, because the taxi driver says, see, if you live on that side of the road, if you're born on that side of the road, you live 20 years longer than if you're born on that side of the road. So it's kind of worrying when that's become almost a kind of folklore thing. But I mean, one thing they've done is, for example, Triple P's been mentioned. The Health Board in Glasgow made Triple P available to everybody. The take-up of it was very high among the better educated, more advantaged people, and almost more non-existent among the less advantaged, poorer people in the community. So I think there's clearly a distance to go. It's not about people. Clearly the better educated people didn't feel at all stigmatised by going along to these classes. But the people who needed it more clearly did. Now, there's an issue there about not just universal provision, but the accessibility and acceptability of the kind of provision and how we overcome these kind of barriers. And I think that's critically important when we talk about universal services. And I think, if you look again, and I am not knocking some of these programmes that have come from, some of the Anglophone world, but I do think we've got to look at the countries that do best in equality, educational attainment, health outcomes throughout the life course. And these countries are ones where there is an acceptance of universal provision. And it's not just about trying to target or pick out people or offer certain programmes. It's saying that we can offer a service to all our children and families that is a comprehensive support service. And someone mentioned the tension between the kind of employment and economic agenda and the kind of family support agenda. If you look at countries like Norway, they've ceased to see a distinction there. They say, let's just have a place with well-qualified staff which allows parents to work or study, but also provides the children with the stimulation, support and input they need to complement, or in some cases compensate for, what they're getting within their family, but also form a relationship with the parents that means that if we give them good advice, they're more likely to act on it. Now, I know that it looks like a very kind of expensive service, and I think the Scottish Government are guilty of trying to offer, a promise to deliver Scandinavian-type services with a US-style taxation, which I think is probably not realistic. But I think that what we are doing is trying to say that we want to move towards this kind of type of support that is available and acceptable to everyone. And I mean, the take-up, and nobody feels it's stigmatising to use these services in any of the Nordic countries. They see it as a right and entitlement. And they see support through that as a right and entitlement. So I think that's the kind of thing I would be looking towards. I take the point about the huge amount that's spent on compensatory provision when you've got to start intervening in people's lives. And I think, yes, we're all kind of facing austerity. We're all facing, difficult economic times throughout Europe, though less so in those countries that have more equitable economic systems than in others. And I think that we need to look at where we are spending our money and are we actually getting the best out of the resources we're putting in. Because as I said earlier, the OECD figures show that across the board we are actually spending as much as some of these countries on per head on our children.
Okay, and I've actually got one final question, which is really for Stella, because we've had a very rich discussion, but I've been wondering through all of this, what are we going to do next? And I'm sure that's a question that is on lots of other people's minds here. So can I just ask, perhaps Stella, just to finish this off by saying a bit about the next steps?
Thank you. I think it's been great today. I think the quality of the speakers, Pip and Marion and Mary, and I think the fact that they have been able to raise questions and issues, and I think provide a lot of food for thought, which is really good. I'm not too sure how far we'll have got, particularly talking to the Minister about the inclusion of a parenting strategy, but I do think it's an opportune time, and I think it's incumbent on all of us who are working out there in service delivery to try and do what we can as a combined group to try and put pressure and try to influence both in the north in terms of the Department of Health and Social Service and Public Safety, and also in the south here in terms of the Department of Children and Youth Affairs, where they are still in the process of developing the various different strands of the National Children and Young People's Policy Framework. So there's still time in terms of the inclusion of a standalone parenting strategy. This is the first public exposure of the special interest group. We don't have any mandate. We're just a group of people who CES have brought together. But I think we've come a long way. I think the fact that there's been such a big turnout today and we had to turn people away, which is also a very positive thing. And what we want you to fill out the form in the back, because we asked your opinion about the position paper and your opinion about where we should go to now. We are going to reflect on that. We are meeting it as a group. We're going to keep the current membership of the group. We're going to look at all your feedback, and we're going to reflect on that when we meet in September. And then hopefully we'll be able to take it forward in terms of kind of new ideas that we will kind of disseminate widely amongst those who attended today and also with your organisations.
Okay, thanks, Stella. And if you want to fill in the form now, just leave it on your seats and we'll collect them afterwards. If you want to send an email in to Stella, I think her email address is on it, with any reflections on the day or what you think happens next, because we don't know. So we're going to see what comes out of this day, what your feedback is. Can I close just by saying a very special thank you to the speakers, to Professor Mary Daly, Marion MacLeod, as well as to Stella and Pip. Thank you. And just a couple of other thank yous. I'd like to thank all the members of the Special Interest Group for their financial contribution for this event and for all the support during the last couple of years in making this come together, and especially to the Catherine Howard Foundation for their additional funding, to the Centre for Effective Services for hosting the work of the Special Interest Group and for managing the symposium, and especially both to Stella and to Breda for all Breda's work in actually the logistics of the day. Thanks to the Chartered Accountants House for letting us use the venue. And finally, thank you to all of you for travelling very long distances from right across Ireland and Northern Ireland for, I think, what was a very useful, interesting, stimulating discussion, and I hope is just the beginning of further discussions and further action.